Lena Crawford approached the intimidating double doors of Richard Wentworth's office with a pounding heart. She had been rehearsing this moment for days, going over the right words to say and the best way to present the news. Richard Wentworth, the CEO of the company where Lena worked as an executive assistant, was known for his exacting standards and detached demeanor. His office was a fortress of luxury, furnished with leather-bound chairs, dark oak bookshelves, and a grand mahogany desk that seemed to swallow whoever stood before it. Even the soft lighting seemed to be precisely calculated to convey authority without warmth. Lena took a deep breath, reminding herself that she had a right to be here, that she wasn't asking for permission, only informing her employer of a change in her life. With all the courage she could muster, she knocked on the door. There was a brief pause before a curt voice from within called out, "Come in." When Lena entered, Richard didn't immediately look up. He was engrossed in something on his computer screen, fingers tapping rhythmically against the keyboard. For a moment, Lena hesitated in the doorway, wondering if she should wait to be acknowledged or clear her throat to gain his attention. But Richard's demeanor was unwaveringly cold, not offering any invitation to break the silence. "Mr. Wentworth?" Lena said softly, trying not to let her voice quiver. Richard still didn't raise his head. "Yes," he responded, his tone clipped and absent. His eyes remained fixed on the screen in front of him, as if Lena's presence was barely a disruption. Lena shifted her weight from one foot to the other, trying to regain her composure. "I wanted to inform you that I'm pregnant," she said, keeping her voice steady and professional. At the mention of the word pregnant, Richard's fingers stopped moving. He lifted his gaze, but only slightly, just enough to acknowledge Lena's words. The flicker of emotion on his face was so fleeting that Lena couldn't tell if it was irritation, annoyance, or simply surprise. Richard closed the laptop in front of him and leaned back slightly in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Pregnant," he repeated, almost as if testing the word on his tongue. Lena gave a small nod, unsure of what else to say. Richard's expression was unreadable. He seemed to measure each word before he spoke. "And how far along are you?" he asked, a thin veneer of politeness attempting to mask his real feelings. 4 months, Lena replied, trying to maintain eye contact. It was one of the confidence tricks she had taught herself over the years. Make them believe you belong here, and eventually they will too. But Richard's gaze remained piercing and clinical. 4 months, he echoed, as if calculating something. There was a long pause, and Lena felt the silence pressing down on her. Richard didn't congratulate her. He didn't offer any kind words. He simply tilted his head slightly and said, "Well, I trust you've given some thought to how this will impact your role here." It was less of a question and more of a warning. Lena knew exactly what he was insinuating, that her pregnancy was a complication, an inconvenience to the smooth functioning of his office. She felt her face flush, but she kept her composure. "Yes," she said firmly. "I've considered it, and I believe I can continue to perform my duties effectively." Richard's lips tightened into a thin smile. "I see," he said. "But we must be realistic, Lena. This development may require certain adjustments, for the sake of efficiency, of course." He let the words hang in the air like an unspoken threat, and Lena understood that this was not a conversation about her well-being or her future. It was a warning that she was now walking a very fine line. "Thank you, Mr. Wentworth," Lena said, excusing herself before the tension in the room could grow any thicker. She turned and left, feeling as though a chill had seeped into her bones. The hallway felt longer than usual, as she walked back to her desk, her mind racing with the implications of Richard's words. In the days following her announcement, Lena began to notice small but significant changes in her workload. Tasks she had been handling for years, such as coordinating executive meetings and managing critical projects, were suddenly reassigned. At first, Lena thought it might just be a coincidence, a routine redistribution of responsibilities. But the pattern continued. An email arrived one morning from the operations team with a new set of tasks, a list of basic administrative duties that felt like busy work, far below the scope of her usual responsibilities. The message was polite, but detached, as if carefully crafted to seem neutral. Lena couldn't ignore the subtle yet unmistakable shift. Where she had once been in charge of crucial events and executive calendars, she was now relegated to scheduling appointments and taking meeting notes. It felt like being slowly pushed out of the inner circle without any explicit words being spoken. There was no official demotion, no changes to her title or salary, just a steady erosion of her responsibilities, chipping away at the authority she had built over the years. It didn't stop there. Lena started to receive fewer invitations to the strategic planning sessions she had once played a key role in managing. A new assistant, Emily, was suddenly assigned to assist with the high-profile projects Lena used to oversee. Emily was young and eager, clearly unaware of the intricacies of the office politics. Lena knew it wasn't Emily's fault, but it was hard not to feel the sting of being sidelined, piece by piece. Still, Lena did her best to remain professional and composed. She didn't want to give Richard or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing her falter. But the atmosphere in the office seemed to shift as well. Colleagues who had once sought her out for advice or collaboration now seemed distant, as if uncertain of how to interact with her. The polite smiles and casual conversations were replaced by a strained politeness that bordered on avoidance. Lena knew that Richard was behind this. His words from their meeting echoed in her mind. We must be realistic. He wasn't directly cutting her off from her work, but his subtle manipulations were pushing her out of relevance. It was a classic strategy: make her role so diminished that she would eventually feel the need to step down of her own accord. That way, Richard could claim he had done nothing wrong, that she had simply chosen to leave. But Lena wasn't going to make it that easy for him. She was determined to document every change, every minor slight, and every redirection of her duties. She kept a meticulous record of every meeting she was excluded from, every task she was reassigned. It wasn't just a gut feeling anymore. It was a pattern, a calculated effort to force her out. And as the days went by, Lena's resolve hardened. She wouldn't let Richard quietly erase her from the company. Yet, even as she tried to focus on her work, there was a growing awareness that the walls were closing in. Lena couldn't help but wonder what would come next, and how far Richard would go to make her feel unwelcome. The subtle erosion of Lena's responsibilities continued for weeks. She knew she had to tread carefully, maintaining a professional facade while the foundation of her role was being quietly dismantled. But one day, Lena's resolve was put to the test in an unexpected way. It started with an impromptu visit to the break room for a much-needed coffee. She wasn't supposed to be there at that time. Her schedule rarely allowed her the luxury of a morning break, but an early meeting had been canceled without warning. She hadn't even been informed of the cancellation. She'd found out when she arrived at an empty conference room. Lena entered the break room to find two men standing by the counter, Richard Wentworth and Carl Henderson, the chief operations officer. Carl was known for his gruff demeanor and blunt way of speaking, a man who wore his prejudices openly when he felt comfortable enough to do so. The two men were speaking in hushed tones, unaware of Lena's quiet presence by the doorway. "You can't let her get away with this," Carl muttered, his voice low and angry. "She's using it as an excuse, Richard." "An excuse?" Richard responded, feigning innocence, though his tone held a trace of irritation. "That's one way to put it, Carl." Carl snorted in disdain. People like her always find a way to make themselves into a burden. You give them an inch, they take a mile. Now we're supposed to cater to her needs just because she's knocked up? Lena's stomach turned, and she felt the blood drain from her face. The words hung heavily in the air, making the room feel stiflingly small. She fought the urge to confront them then and there, her fists clenching at her sides. But she knew better. Bursting in now, fueled by anger, wouldn't achieve anything. It would just give them more ammunition to use against her. She forced herself to take a quiet breath and listen. Richard, still leaning casually against the counter, spoke in a calm and calculating voice. "It's unfortunate timing," he said, "and I've tried to be accommodating. But this is a business, not a charity. If she can't keep up with her responsibilities, she's putting everyone else at risk." The words stung like a slap. Lena realized with chilling clarity that Richard was crafting a narrative, one where she was the villain, not the victim. It was a careful manipulation of reality, one designed to justify any actions he might take against her. Carl's agreeing nod only confirmed it. They were already speaking as if Lena's exit was a foregone conclusion, their prejudice thinly veiled beneath a guise of professional concern. It was then that Lena knew she couldn't rely on formal complaints or casual conversations with HR. She would need hard evidence if she wanted to expose what was happening. She quietly slipped away from the break room, her mind racing with a mix of anger and determination. She needed to document everything, every remark, every slight, every attempt to force her out. Later that day, Lena made a stop at an electronics store. She had read about small recording devices and apps that could document conversations discreetly. Lena didn't want to resort to this. It felt like a violation of her principles. But after what she had overheard, she had no choice. The stakes were higher than just her job. Her dignity and her future were on the line. Armed with her new recording device, Lena began capturing Richard's and Carl's conversations whenever she found herself within earshot. She didn't always catch them saying something explicitly incriminating, but every conversation revealed a new layer of the bias and resentment they held against her. They spoke about Lena as if she were an obstacle to be removed, not a person to be valued. Over time, she compiled hours of recorded evidence, and her confidence grew as she realized she had the power to expose their true colors. Lena decided to take her concerns to human resources, hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone would listen. Monica Jensen, the head of HR, had always projected an air of professionalism and concern for employee welfare. But Lena had a suspicion that Monica was not the neutral party she claimed to be. Still, it was worth a try. "Monica," Lena said one day, after arranging a private meeting in the HR office, "I need to talk to you about something important. I believe I'm being treated unfairly by Mr. Wentworth." Monica raised an eyebrow, giving Lena a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, Lena. Please, sit down and tell me what's going on." Lena described the shifts in her workload, the exclusion from meetings, and the overheard conversations between Richard and Carl. She left out the recordings for now, wanting to gauge Monica's reaction first. As Lena spoke, she noticed Monica taking a few notes, but the HR director's expression remained neutral. I understand your concerns, Monica said when Lena finished. But you must realize that Richard has a lot of responsibilities and pressures as the CEO. He might not always be aware of how his actions are perceived. I'm sure there's no malicious intent here. Lena's frustration simmered beneath the surface. It's not just about perception, she replied. I'm being systematically sidelined, and it's directly related to my pregnancy. I overheard him and Carl referring to me as a liability. Monica's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of mild concern, but Lena could see it was more performative than genuine. I'll have a conversation with Richard, Monica said. But you must understand that these kinds of accusations are very serious, and they need to be handled delicately. Delicately, Lena repeated, feeling a knot tighten in her stomach. It was a word that suggested inaction and deflection, not resolution. Monica was doing her job, protecting the company, not the employee. Over the next few weeks, Lena's suspicion about Monica's loyalty was confirmed. She heard nothing more about her complaint, and the discrimination continued. Lena knew that the HR director's role was not to be an advocate for employees, but to safeguard the company's interests. She realized she was on her own in this fight. Lena meticulously compiled a folder with detailed notes, recordings, and emails. She gathered every scrap of evidence she could find, knowing that the day would come when she would have to confront Richard directly. The stress took its toll, and Lena found herself more exhausted than ever. But she refused to back down. She wouldn't let them push her out without a fight. That day came sooner than she expected. Richard summoned Lena to his office for a performance discussion, and when she arrived, Monica was already there, sitting at Richard's side like an accomplice. Lena knew what this meeting was really about. It was a final push to force her out. Richard greeted her with a cold, businesslike demeanor. He shuffled a stack of papers in front of him, his face expressionless. Monica offered Lena a polite smile that felt more like a smirk. "Lena," Richard began, his voice flat and detached. "We need to talk about some ongoing performance issues that have come to my attention. There have been several missed deadlines and some serious lapses in judgment." Lena felt her blood boil. She had expected this, but it was still infuriating to hear the outright lies being presented as facts. She kept her composure and waited for him to finish. When Richard paused, Lena took a deep breath and spoke firmly. "That's not true, and you know it," she said. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of annoyance breaking through his mask of professionalism. "Excuse me?" Richard replied, his voice dripping with feigned incredulity. "You've been trying to push me out for weeks," Lena continued, her voice unwavering. "You've taken away my responsibilities, excluded me from meetings, and allowed Carl to make racist and demeaning comments about me. I've documented everything, and I've been recording our conversations." There it was, the moment of truth. Lena saw the shift in Richard's expression, the flash of anger and fear that he quickly tried to suppress. Monica's eyes widened, and she glanced nervously at Richard. For a moment, the room was silent, and Lena felt a surge of vindication. Richard recovered quickly, his face hardening into a mask of controlled fury. "Recording conversations without consent?" he said, his voice dangerously low. "That's a serious breach of trust, Lena." Lena met his gaze without flinching. "It's not illegal in this state, and given the circumstances, I felt it was necessary to protect myself. I have every right to defend myself against discrimination and mistreatment." Richard stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "You're out of line," he snapped, his composure finally slipping. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Lena didn't back down. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," she replied calmly, "and so will my lawyer." The mention of legal action seemed to strike a nerve. Richard clenched his fists, his face turning red with rage. Monica stood up as well, trying to regain control of the situation. "Lena, let's not escalate this any further." But it was too late. Richard's temper flared, and he shouted after Lena as she turned to leave the office. His voice rang out, echoing through the hallways, and his words were unmistakable. "You're just using this pregnancy as an excuse. You think you can waltz in here and play the victim? You're not fooling anyone." Lena stopped in her tracks, turning back to face Richard. A group of co-workers had gathered in the hallway, their eyes wide with shock. Richard's outburst had drawn an audience, and now there was no taking it back. Lena's voice was steady as she responded, her words clear and deliberate. "Thank you, Mr. Wentworth," she said. "You've just given me exactly what I needed." With that, Lena walked away, leaving Richard fuming in the middle of the office. She felt a strange sense of relief wash over her, knowing that the facade had finally crumbled. Now, there was no turning back. She had the evidence, and she was ready to fight for justice. Lena left Richard's office with her heart racing, her mind reeling from what had just transpired. As she stepped into the open area of the office, her co-workers' stunned faces met her gaze. A heavy silence blanketed the room, and for a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. Lena could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her, and yet she didn't falter. She held her head high, refusing to let Richard's words linger in the air without a response. Richard, still standing in the doorway of his office, seemed to realize the extent of his mistake. His face was flushed with anger, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He had let his temper get the better of him, and now there was no way to cover up the words he had just hurled at Lena. He took a step forward, as if to continue the confrontation, but Lena calmly turned to face him. In a clear, unwavering voice, Lena said, "Mr. Wentworth, you've crossed the line. This isn't just about me anymore. Everyone here has witnessed your behavior. You've shown your true colors." There was a murmur of agreement from the onlookers, some of whom had been keeping their heads down, unwilling to draw attention to themselves. Lena felt a surge of confidence as she saw their reactions. She wasn't alone in this fight. People had heard Richard's outburst, and now there was no denying what had been said. Richard's eyes darted around the room, taking in the faces of his employees. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. His expression hardened, and he turned abruptly, retreating into his office without another word. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving the office in a tense silence. Lena took a deep breath, steadying herself. She felt the adrenaline coursing through her veins, but she knew that she couldn't afford to lose her composure now. She had to stay strong, for herself and for the others who might be facing similar treatment. As she walked back to her desk, a few of her co-workers offered her sympathetic looks or brief nods of support. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her hope that she wasn't fighting this battle alone. Later that day, Lena called her lawyer, Jonathan Marks. She had chosen Jonathan not just for his reputation as a skilled litigator, but because he had a track record of taking on cases that involved workplace discrimination. When she arrived at his office, Jonathan greeted her with a firm handshake and a reassuring smile. "Lena," he said, gesturing for her to sit down. "I read through the summary you sent me, but I'd like to hear everything directly from you." Lena recounted the events of the past several months, the gradual sidelining of her responsibilities, the inappropriate comments from Carl, the hostile meeting with Richard, and the final explosive outburst in front of her co-workers. Jonathan listened attentively, occasionally jotting down notes, but mostly focusing on Lena's words. When she finished, Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You've done an excellent job documenting everything," he said. "The recordings you've gathered and the witnesses who were present for Richard's outburst will be crucial to building your case." Lena felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Do you really think we have a chance?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Jonathan's smile was confident, but not dismissive. "Lena, I've handled cases like this before. The evidence you've collected is strong, and it shows a clear pattern of discrimination. But I won't lie to you. This isn't going to be an easy fight. Richard Wentworth has power and resources, and he'll do everything he can to discredit you." Lena nodded, her resolve solidifying. "I'm not afraid," she said, and she meant it. She had been through too much to back down now. In the following weeks, the lawsuit gained traction. Jonathan filed a formal complaint, and the case was set in motion. As news of the lawsuit spread throughout the office, Lena noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Some of her co-workers started to approach her quietly, expressing their support and offering to provide testimony if needed. They had witnessed Richard's discriminatory behavior, and many of them had their own grievances to share. The support bolstered Lena's resolve, but she also knew that the battle ahead would be grueling. Richard, clearly panicking as the lawsuit gained momentum, requested a private meeting with Lena. Jonathan advised her to agree to the meeting, but to be cautious. They both knew that Richard would likely try to settle the matter privately to avoid further public scrutiny. When Lena entered the conference room for the meeting, Richard was already there, flanked by two of his attorneys. His demeanor was calm, but Lena could sense the underlying tension. Richard's lawyers greeted her formally, but there was no warmth in their eyes. "Lena," Richard began, his tone measured and businesslike, "I want to resolve this situation in a way that's mutually beneficial. There's no need for things to get ugly." Lena remained silent, waiting to hear what he had to say. Richard continued, "I'm prepared to offer you a substantial sum of money to drop this lawsuit. It's in everyone's best interest to avoid a prolonged legal battle, don't you think?" Lena could feel the anger simmering beneath the surface, but she kept her voice steady as she replied, "This isn't about money, Richard. It's about accountability. You treated me unfairly, and you made it clear that my pregnancy was an inconvenience to you. You allowed discriminatory remarks to go unchecked, and you tried to force me out of my job. This isn't something I can just walk away from." Richard's expression hardened, and one of his lawyers leaned forward, clearly preparing to interject. But Lena didn't give them the chance. "This is about justice," Lena continued, her voice resolute. "It's about making sure that no one else has to go through what I did. If you think you can buy my silence, you're wrong." The meeting ended without a resolution, and Lena knew that the fight was only going to get tougher from here. But she didn't regret her decision. She had made her stand, and she was determined to see it through to the end. The trial began a few months later. Lena's lawyer, Jonathan, meticulously prepared her for what was to come. He explained the strategies the defense would likely use, warning her that they would try to paint her as overreacting or unreliable. Lena felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach, but she knew she had the truth on her side. In the courtroom, Jonathan presented the evidence Lena had collected, including the audio recordings of Richard's conversations and the testimonies of her co-workers who had witnessed the discrimination. The defense tried to poke holes in Lena's story, questioning her motives and insinuating that she had been looking for a way to undermine Richard. But Jonathan was ready for their tactics. He skillfully countered each argument, drawing attention to the consistency of Lena's documentation and the corroboration from her colleagues. When it was Lena's turn to take the stand, she felt a wave of nerves wash over her. She glanced at Jonathan, who gave her an encouraging nod, and then she took a deep breath and began to speak. She recounted her experiences in detail, describing how she had been gradually pushed out of her role and subjected to demeaning comments about her pregnancy. She spoke about the toll it had taken on her, both professionally and personally, and how she had felt powerless against a system that seemed determined to silence her. The defense lawyer tried to rattle her, suggesting that she had misinterpreted Richard's actions and that her recordings had been taken out of context. But Lena held her ground, refusing to let them twist the narrative. "I didn't misinterpret anything," Lena said firmly. "Richard made it clear that he saw my pregnancy as a liability. He questioned my ability to do my job, and he allowed Carl to make racist remarks without any repercussions. This isn't just about me. It's about a culture of discrimination that needs to be exposed." The courtroom was silent as Lena finished speaking. She could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air, and she knew that she had done everything she could to make her case. Now, it was up to the judge to decide. The trial dragged on for several more days, with witnesses taking the stand and evidence being presented from both sides. But in the end, the truth couldn't be ignored. When the judge delivered the verdict, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The judge ruled in Lena's favor, awarding her a substantial settlement and ordering an investigation into Richard's company. Richard's face was a mask of disbelief and anger as the judge delivered the final ruling. The media, which had been following the case closely, wasted no time in reporting the verdict, exposing Richard's discriminatory practices to the public. Lena felt a wave of relief wash over her as the judge concluded the proceedings. It was finally over. She had won. The judge's ruling reverberated like a shockwave through the company and beyond. News outlets quickly picked up the story, and headlines about Richard Wentworth's discriminatory practices flooded the media. Lena had not only won her case, but had also sparked a broader conversation about workplace discrimination, pregnancy bias, and racism in corporate culture. While the verdict brought a sense of vindication and relief, Lena knew that the true battle had only just begun. Richard's reputation crumbled almost overnight. Reports of the trial and its damning details circulated widely, from business journals to social media platforms. Richard had built an image as a shrewd, decisive leader, but now his true colors were laid bare for everyone to see. His carefully curated public persona was shattered, replaced by a narrative of bigotry, misconduct, and toxic leadership. The board of directors acted swiftly in an attempt to salvage the company's reputation. They convened emergency meetings behind closed doors, struggling to come up with a plan to mitigate the damage. Lena's victory had not only tarnished Richard's name, but also cast a long shadow over the company as a whole. Investors started to pull out, worried that the scandal would impact the company's value and long-term viability. Employees, too, began to question their allegiance to an organization that had fostered such a toxic environment. After the trial, Lena returned to her modest apartment, feeling the exhaustion of the months-long battle weighing heavily on her. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the stack of legal documents and newspaper clippings that chronicled her fight. It felt surreal, as if she were watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. She had been through so much, and yet, the sense of closure she had hoped for was elusive. There was a quiet unease within her, a lingering doubt about whether justice had truly been served or if this victory would spark lasting change. A few days later, Lena received an unexpected visitor. Linda Caldwell, the former head of HR who had resigned shortly after the trial began. Linda had been one of the first to distance herself from Richard and his toxic leadership, but her departure had raised questions about her role in enabling the discriminatory environment. Lena wasn't sure what to expect when she saw Linda standing at her doorstep, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Lena," Linda began softly, I wasn't sure if I should come, but I felt like I needed to talk to you." Lena hesitated for a moment before opening the door wider. "Come in," she said, her voice wary but open. She led Linda to the small living room where they sat facing each other. There was an awkward silence, punctuated only by the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the background. "I just wanted to say," Linda started, her voice faltering, "I'm sorry. I should have done more to support you. I should have stood up to Richard, but I didn't. And for that, I'm deeply ashamed." Lena studied Linda's face, trying to gauge her sincerity. Linda looked different from the confident HR director Lena remembered. Her shoulders were slouched, and there was a weariness in her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and inner turmoil. Lena could sense that Linda's remorse was genuine, and yet it didn't erase the months of silence and complicity. "I appreciate you coming here," Lena replied carefully, her tone guarded. "But you had the power to help me when it mattered, and you chose not to. I needed an advocate, and instead, you stayed loyal to Richard and the company." Linda nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I let fear control me. I was so focused on protecting my career and my reputation that I lost sight of what was right. By the time I realized how deeply wrong things had gotten, it was too late." Lena felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a strange sense of empathy. She knew what it was like to feel powerless in the face of authority, to fear the repercussions of speaking out. But Lena also knew that there was a line between self-preservation and enabling injustice. "I spent months documenting every slight, every comment, and every act of sabotage," Lena said, her voice trembling with emotion. "And all that time, I kept thinking, if just one person in a position of power had the courage to speak up, maybe things could have been different." Linda's tears spilled over, and she quickly wiped them away. "I know," she said again, her voice thick with regret. "I can't undo the past, but I want you to know that I'm committed to doing better in the future. I'm working with a group that advocates for workplace equality and diversity, and I'm trying to make amends for my mistakes." Lena appreciated Linda's words, but she knew that apologies couldn't erase the pain of the past. "I hope you do," Lena said quietly, "because the next person in my position shouldn't have to go through this alone." Linda nodded, understanding the weight of Lena's words. The conversation ended on a somber note, with Linda expressing her gratitude for the opportunity to speak and offering her contact information in case Lena ever needed support or wanted to stay in touch. Lena didn't know if she would ever reach out, but she appreciated the gesture nonetheless. After Linda left, Lena sat in silence, reflecting on the unexpected encounter. It didn't change what had happened, but it felt like a small step towards healing, a recognition of the wrongs that had been done, and a commitment to doing better in the future. Lena knew that change wouldn't come overnight, but she hoped that the trial and its aftermath would serve as a wake-up call for others in similar positions. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the trial continued to ripple through the company. An internal investigation was launched, and several executives who had been complicit in Richard's behavior were quietly let go. The company issued a public statement, acknowledging the discrimination that had taken place and pledging to implement new policies and training programs to prevent future incidents. It was a step in the right direction, but Lena remained skeptical of the company's ability to enact real, lasting change. One evening, as Lena was sitting in her living room, her husband, David, called from overseas. He was serving in the military, and they had been separated for months while he was on deployment. The sound of his voice was a balm to Lena's frayed nerves, and she felt a rush of emotion as she heard the familiar warmth and strength in his words. "I heard the news," David said, his voice tinged with pride. "You did it, Lena. You stood up for yourself, and you won." Lena smiled, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied, her voice choked with emotion. "You were always there, even from a distance." David's voice was gentle but firm. "You're stronger than you know, Lena. I'm so proud of you." As they talked, Lena felt a sense of closure beginning to take shape. She had faced her fears, fought for her dignity, and won a hard-fought battle. But more importantly, she had reclaimed her voice and her power. The scars of the past would always be there, but they no longer defined her. Lena knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges, but she felt ready to face them with newfound resilience and hope for the future. Lena spent the next few weeks preparing for David's return. She wanted to create a sense of peace and stability for their family, and she poured her energy into making their home a place of warmth and love. She set up a nursery for their baby, carefully choosing soft colors and comforting decor. Each item she placed in the room felt like a step towards a new beginning, a life free from the shadows of the past. When David finally returned home, Lena greeted him with open arms, and they held each other tightly, savoring the long-awaited reunion. It felt like a moment of renewal, a chance to start fresh and build the life they had always dreamed of. Lena's story became a beacon of hope for others who had faced similar struggles. She received messages from people all over the country, thanking her for her courage and sharing their own experiences of discrimination and injustice. Lena knew that her victory wasn't just her own. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been silenced or marginalized. In the end, Lena's journey wasn't just about winning a legal battle or exposing a corrupt CEO. It was about reclaiming her voice, standing up for what was right, and finding the strength to move forward. Lena had faced unimaginable challenges, but she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined to fight for a better future, not just for herself, but for her family and for all those who would come after her. Lena's life had begun to stabilize after the intense whirlwind of the lawsuit. The company's internal investigation resulted in major shakeups within the leadership, with Richard Wentworth forced to resign in disgrace and other key executives quietly leaving their posts. The board publicly committed to implementing sweeping changes, appointing new leaders, and introducing comprehensive anti-discrimination training. Despite the victory, Lena found it difficult to fully trust that real change would come from these promises. She knew that corporate culture was not something that shifted overnight. It was ingrained in every meeting, every casual conversation, every unspoken rule. For Lena, the weeks following the trial were not just about adjusting to life after the courtroom. It was about healing, physically, emotionally, and mentally, from the battles she had faced. But she also knew there were people still watching her, still scrutinizing her every move, expecting her to either rise with newfound strength or crumble under the pressure. Lena was determined to prove that she would do neither. She would simply live. As she continued her day-to-day life, one day, a knock came at her door that brought a bittersweet reminder of her fight. When she opened it, Linda Caldwell stood there again, this time looking less like the anxious former HR director she had once been, and more like a woman with a purpose. Linda held a small bouquet of flowers in one hand and an envelope in the other. Lena invited her in, and they exchanged polite pleasantries before sitting down at the kitchen table. "I didn't come to burden you with apologies again," Linda began, her voice steady and sincere. "I came to tell you what's been happening since you stood up." Lena listened as Linda recounted how the new leadership team had begun making tangible changes within the company. Linda, who had taken a temporary position with an organization advocating for corporate accountability, had been monitoring the changes closely. She explained that Richard's resignation was more than a symbolic victory. His departure, coupled with the company's new policies, had sparked a broader movement among other companies in the same industry to re-examine their own internal cultures. Lena's case had lit a fire of awareness, pushing many to confront the uncomfortable truth that discrimination wasn't just a theoretical issue, but a lived reality for so many. "Your courage changed things, Lena," Linda said quietly. "People are paying attention now. They're listening, and they're acting." Lena absorbed Linda's words with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. It was reassuring to know that her fight had made a difference, but the cost had been high, and the wounds still fresh. Yet, hearing Linda's update gave her a sense of closure she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about her victory. It was about the ripples of change that were spreading beyond her immediate sphere. The two women sat for a while longer, talking about their hopes for the future. Lena expressed her cautious optimism, knowing that the road ahead would still be challenging for many, but hopeful that her story had made it a little easier for others to speak up. Linda left that day with a promise to keep Lena updated on her advocacy work, and with a final apology that, this time, felt truly accepted. Days turned into weeks, and Lena's focus shifted back to her growing family. David's return from his military deployment marked a new beginning for them. They had faced so many hardships apart, but now they were together, ready to build the life they had always wanted. Lena felt a mix of emotions as she prepared for the arrival of their baby. The nursery she had meticulously decorated was a place of peace and anticipation, a stark contrast to the chaotic year she had endured. David's return was a joyous occasion, filled with laughter, tears, and quiet moments of reconnection. He had always been Lena's rock, and now that he was back, Lena felt an overwhelming sense of relief and gratitude. They spent hours talking, catching up on all the moments they had missed, and planning for their future as a family. Lena found comfort in David's steady presence and his unwavering support. He had followed her journey from afar, and now he was here to help her move forward. One afternoon, as Lena sat in the nursery folding tiny clothes and organizing baby supplies, David joined her, taking a seat beside her on the floor. He watched her for a moment, a gentle smile playing on his lips. "Do you remember when we first talked about having a family?" David asked softly, his voice filled with nostalgia. Lena paused, looking up at him with a fond smile. "I do," she replied. "We were so young and so full of dreams." David chuckled, shaking his head. "We still are," he said. "We've just faced a few more challenges along the way." Lena nodded, her heart swelling with emotion. "I couldn't have gotten through this without you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. David reached out, taking her hand in his. "You would have, Lena," he said firmly. You're stronger than anyone I've ever known." They sat together in the quiet nursery, surrounded by the promise of new beginnings. For the first time in a long while, Lena felt a sense of peace. She had faced her demons, fought her battles, and emerged on the other side. Now, it was time to embrace the future. As the days passed, Lena received more messages and letters from people who had followed her case. Some were from women who had faced similar challenges in their workplaces, thanking Lena for giving them the courage to stand up. Others were from organizations and advocates, expressing their admiration for her resilience and offering support in her journey. Lena was humbled by the outpouring of kindness and solidarity, and she realized that her story was no longer just her own. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced or marginalized. The birth of Lena's baby marked a new chapter in her life. Holding her newborn son in her arms, Lena felt a profound sense of fulfillment and joy. It was as if all the pain and struggle had led to this moment, a moment of pure, unadulterated love and hope. David stood beside her, gazing down at their son with tears in his eyes. "He's perfect," David whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Lena nodded, her own eyes filled with tears. "He is," she agreed softly, "and he's ours." The family embraced, savoring the sweetness of the moment. It was a new beginning, a fresh start after so many months of uncertainty and turmoil. Lena knew that life would still have its challenges, but she felt ready to face them with David by her side and their son in her arms. As the months went by, Lena gradually settled into her new role as a mother. She continued to advocate for workplace equality, working with organizations and speaking at events to raise awareness about discrimination and bias. Her story had become a source of inspiration for many, and Lena embraced the responsibility that came with it. She wanted to be a voice for those who couldn't speak up, to shine a light on the injustices that still persisted in so many workplaces. One evening, as Lena sat on the porch of their new home, rocking her son in her arms, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. It had been a long and difficult road, filled with pain, anger, and moments of doubt. But it had also been a journey of growth, resilience, and self-discovery. Lena had learned to trust her own voice, to stand up for herself and others, and to never let anyone diminish her worth. David joined her on the porch, wrapping an arm around her shoulders and gazing out at the sunset. They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the past slowly lifting with each passing moment. Lena felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life they had built together and the family they had created. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lena knew that her fight wasn't over. There were still battles to be fought and changes to be made. But she also knew that she wasn't alone in this fight. She had David, her son, and a community of supporters who believed in her and her mission. Lena's story was one of resilience, courage, and hope. It was a reminder that even in the face of adversity, one person's voice could make a difference. And as she held her son close, Lena made a silent promise to herself to keep fighting for a better future, not just for her family, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless or unheard. The hardships of the past were now behind her, and Lena was ready to embrace the future with open arms. She had faced her fears, confronted her demons, and emerged stronger than ever. And in the end, that strength had led her to the life she had always dreamed of, a life filled with love, purpose, and hope for what lay ahead.